Case is very simple. Economic recovery is happening anyways. Where this money is being spent is ineffectual and temporary, and this is likely to harm both the US and the global economy in the short term and the long term. I think that the counterfactual in this debate is probably still some spending. We are fine with things like the COVID rescue package to help smaller businesses and to help individual families. What we oppose is a sheer massive things that are being invested in infrastructure projects and welfare, and we support it being saved under our side of a house to a much larger extent. I'm going to be talking about four things in this speech. Firstly, why economic recovery is going to happen anyways. And secondly, why these projects themselves are not super important and temporary. Thirdly, about why this is going to be inflationary and all responses are not worth the trade-off. And then finally, about why more saving actually matters in the long term. On the first thing about why this is not needed as an immediate kind of fiscal stimulus, I have three things to say here. Firstly, COVID rates are decreasing in America due to vaccination, meaning that things are going to open up. Secondly, COVID rates are decreasing around the remainder of the world due to the global vaccination campaign, meaning that US exports to other countries are likely to increase to a larger extent, allowing more profit to be generated. And thirdly, there are already things like huge handouts to deal with COVID, as well as high degrees of saving that happened during the pandemic, because there weren't things like restaurants and bars and movie theaters, meaning that when things open up, you're so likely to get the money multiplier effect via things spending. So a degree of that comes from additional stimulus is probably not necessary in order to get this kind of rejuvenation. The second thing I want to talk about then is why these products themselves are not super important. The first thing to say is that the reason that a lot of them are bad is due to the slim majority that the Democrats end up having in the Senate. They've had to make a variety of concessions to avoid being filibustered by the Republicans, as well as to appease certain Democrats who tend to be more fiscally conservative. What this then means that you need to often include like random clauses in these projects, like things like allowing individual senators to have promises to have infrastructure spending in their states that often make them politically popular, but go into things like useless transportation projects that just end up appeasing wealthier demographics within their own areas. And second thing to say is that Biden is still a political figure, and therefore he has quite short-term incentives with what his policies are. So he's not concerned about things like the long-term structural solving of poverty, because it's not going to help him in midterm or presidential elections. This means that a lot of this money is going into things like immediate boost, like the building of infrastructure that can happen at rapid rates, rather than things that are actually going to create structural kind of change. The third thing to say is that due to politicization, it's unclear that a lot of the good kinds of policies, even if you think that like the Biden family plan are good, are likely to have things like long-term effects. The reason for this is that in a similar way to how the Republicans just ended up repealing and diluting the Affordable Care Act when they came into power, the Democrats are not going to remain in power forever and indefinitely, especially due to Trump's cult of personality and the fact that he might run again. What this then means that when they're in power, there's going to be a huge push by Republicans to roll back all of these policies, meaning that the long-term ones are probably not going to be enacted anyways. And I want to note that when the Democrats are seen as being like pillaging the purses of ordinary American citizens, it's also likely that Republicans are going to try and retaliate by also, if they want to, also engaging in forms of spending themselves, but not to good things, right? Like they might just spend more money building a wall, and it's harder for Democrats to now justify filibustering these kind of policies in response to that when they've effectively conceded that they are fine with massive degrees of spending. Third claim, why is this likely to be inflationary and why are all responses likely to be bad? First piece of characterization is that inflation is something that's probably already going to be pretty high. The reason for this is the characterization that I gave earlier of the economy is opening up, people have been saving, and now that spending is likely to increase. So even without this policy, it might be a problem. I think that there's two tipping points of this policy. Firstly, there's just a huge increase in the money supply. This is literally the most unprecedented spending package in American history. Like US debt is already large, but we're literally increasing the money supply to like a massive, massive extent. What this then means is that the fact that money loses value because you're artificially injecting it more into the economy without legitimate forms of growth means that in order for like businesses to not lose genuine kinds of money, they often have to raise prices in response to this in order to remain relatively profitable at the end of the day. The second tipping point is that absent of real economic conditions, you end up shifting expectations that end up occurring with the economy. So it's the fact that people expect that inflation is going to happen. People want to get on board first, and therefore, even if irrational, prices end up increasing that capacity as well. I think that Op could try and change MMT, but I think that that's nonsense, which is why Lover said that he didn't like understand it when I asked him about it in the econ seminar that we did together. The first thing to say is that within the US economy itself, there's still like internal variances over time. So like inflation has already increased a bit due to Biden's spending package. It's all like remains stagnant. There clearly are changes in responses. Secondly, the US cannot just print an unlimited degree of money because like there are other currencies that exist. It's not like the only currency, and if we're going to be reliant on it forever, there are alternatives that exist. And thirdly, the fact that economists in the Fed believe that like inflation can happen means that they're likely to do things like raise interest rates and all the policies that I'm going to describe. What are the harm to this and what's going to happen in response to inflation? Number one, the US is going to have to raise interest rates, which is one of the most natural ways to calm inflation. This is bad for two reasons. Firstly, internally within the US, this is just going to harm a lot of people. I think it's harder for businesses to do things like take risks after COVID, when it's things like more expensive for them to be able to get loans, and therefore they cannot grow and recover as quickly. I also think that it looks like people being hurt and evicted from COVID, whether being locked out of rental markets, having a more difficult time being able to purchase new property because all those things are more expensive. And secondly, and this is key panel, the largest harm in this debate is that most debt in the world is dollarized. When US interest rates increase, this increases the burden of repaying debt obligations of every single developing country around the world whose economies are presently being ravaged by COVID. What this then means that within their own internal economic recovery, they have less money to be able to invest in things like their own welfare states, to be able to invest in their own corporation. Not all of these governments are corrupt, even if some are. This is still comparatively less money that is trickling down to the people. Before I get into the second response, I'd love to take CO.
So why does the central bank not have an incentive to solve all the problems that you're talking about?
Well, I mean, the central bank is not doing this. Biden is. They're different institutions. The central bank is going to have to do this in response to higher inflation in order that people are not going to be like unable to afford goods in the long term. If you're just going to prop that, like you're going to allow inflation to continue into the future, that's also bad because people are not going to be able to afford basic kinds of goods, especially if they are poor. Secondly, the other way that the US might have to respond is by increasing forms of taxes. I want to note that the tax code often imposes a burden on the poor because huge businesses and rich people have a massive degree of lobbying power, and therefore this is often concentrated in like not the most progressive way. And even if it does, it imposes a burden on them. This is bad because it means that the poor end up having less discretionary spending, even if it appears to be a small amount over the course of like a long period of time. It ends up being a large cumulative impact. I think that a higher tax burden ends up mattering more than a lot of these welfare programs for two reasons. Number one, when people have more money themselves, they have the agency to actually decide what goods to produce rather than Biden deciding what kind of welfare policy is actually best for them. But secondly, it's a guaranteed harm to all people rather than the bureaucracy that often exists in welfare programs that often do not trickle down to all people and often sidelines the lower middle class. The final harm of this is that the US dollar ends up depreciating when inflation ends up increasing. This is bad because other currencies end up appreciating relative to the US dollar. What this then means is that other countries who are trying to regrow their export sectors after COVID end up becoming less competitive relative to the US, meaning that other countries end up losing out on a higher degree of export revenue like Mexico or like a lot of countries in like Asia who are exporting various kinds of manufactured goods to the United States, meaning that their economies do not grow to the same extent. Final claim, it's just not worth it for the US economy in the long term. They end up acquiring a higher degree of debt, meaning that they have less money for economic cushions that they actually need. If there's another wave of COVID, if there's a bust of the business cycle, they have less money to actually spend on essential economic things. For all these reasons, I'm very proud to stand in open government.
Great.
Three, two, one. Notice open government has no comparative. They tell you recovery happens to some extent. They don't tell you for whom, why, and how. We're going to explain why this happens on our side and why it happens better. This plan has two sides, the income side and investment side. I'm going to talk about both of these things, explain why both of them are good. First, on the income side, what does this entail? It entails things like tax cuts for middle-income families, but also additional auxiliary policies like college debt relief or healthcare coverage. The reason why this is important is because recovery on the government side, even if it may happen, happens for the richest who are able to acquire gains on the stock market during COVID. It doesn't happen for the middle-class families whose jobs were closed down, whose restaurants were closed down, who are not able to earn money. This not only means you get more equal recovery, more purchasing power for these citizens, which I think is good on the level of just individual lives, but it also stimulates the internal economy so far as people have more money that can be taxed, but also through the circulation of money. This means that medium and small sized entrepreneurships are more likely to be able to survive. Also, I think this proportion helps the most disprivileged individuals who are members of minority groups, who are among the poor population. No comparative on the government side as to why their recovery plan gets to them. They only say COVID is getting better. That's not enough from their side. We are able to make up for the cost of this plan, however, by significantly increasing the corporate gains tax. Note that a lot of corporations grew on the stock market hugely during COVID because of speculation and because of the motion that we debated in round 5. Note that therefore they themselves have already called for tax cuts to themselves, because given the current idea that corporations are profiting off of the suffering of the small individuals, there have been huge incentives by political consumers to boycott these corporations, which affects their stock share, which means that people like Bill Gates have already called for larger corporate tax cuts, and there is support for this. We need to offset the cost of this policy. Before moving on to the investment side, there's just a couple of things I want to say. On interest rates, this is offset by Naomi's own analysis, because the Fed is already increasing interest rates rates to make up for the losses during the COVID crisis, which means not just that the inflation is going to be lower, but also that insofar as this decreases the purchasing power of individuals because loans are having high interest rates, we have to offset this by providing them other avenues to stimulate spending. Secondly, on the inflation and the debt in developing world point, if Naomi wants to claim that inflation goes up in the US, this means that the exchange rate of the domestic currency in developing countries can buy them more dollars, which makes debt relief easier. She cannot run both arguments at the same time. Matthew has to decide which one he's going to run. On the investment side, and this is an important piece of framing that offsets a lot of the inflationary thing coming from opening government. Most of this is not direct spending and it's not helicopter money. It's investments. What kind of investments are we talking about? Infrastructure, as Naomi concedes, things like roads and like railroads. I would note this is not a short-term investment. You're not going to plow the road out of the ground in the next 50 years. What it enables, though, is reducing shipping costs, making the internal economy more efficient, generate more revenue, which can then be spent in other areas. But I think it also makes commuting easier. A huge amount of individuals have to travel within a state or between states. Insofar as this infrastructure is currently devastated, this means that the costs of maintenance are higher. Therefore, the cost of accessing commuting is higher, which locks people in particular areas and locks them out of job opportunities. But it's also things like digital infrastructure, subsidizing building wide 5G networks. The comparative is that you rely on the private industry for doing this, and they only have an incentive to do this in richer states. If the government does this, it can distribute this more equally, providing access to more individuals, but also being able to digitalize the US economy overall, plugging in supercomputers, the IT sector, and developing it in various parts of the economy based on their comparative advantages. The reason why this is important is because China is already doing this, because the EU is already doing this. So for the US to stay competitive and to get the benefits for US citizens, the US has to do this as well. But secondly, things like investment in green technology, moving away from shale and fracking, which is good because renewable energy is more sustainable and oil is an exhaustible resource, particularly at the rate at which now, but this is also just globally good for the environment, both in the United States of America, because you reduce the huge environmental harms, you reduce the harms to like indigenous people, reservoirs and stuff like this, but just globally, it reduces dependence on carbon and fossil fuels, which reduces the levels of CO2 within the larger economy. But insofar as this is economically efficient and it's going to be proven over time, this also increases capital for the US to return to commitments within the Paris Agreement and stuff like this, also good for the environment globally. What this means, this is not just short-term projects. This is about investment and restructuring of the US economy. Lastly, this also means things like subsidies for housing, spending to encourage people to buy American, all of these things again strengthen the internal economy. Why is this particularly important? COVID context. North America may be recovering from COVID, but its economy has still been hit very hard, and economic recovery is lagging behind the number of rates that has been decreasing, Naomi. Secondly, it's incredibly uncertain. The Delta variant has been growing in the fucking United Kingdom that has the largest vaccination program in the world. Also, the US just uses worse vaccines because Janssen is less efficient than vaccines produced by, Moderna and Pfizer and stuff like this. So it's incredibly uncertain. And even if this doesn't happen, this uncertainty means there are less foreign direct investment in America. This combined by the fact that the trade war with China has hugely harmed American exports, but also that America has trade deficits with pretty much all of its trade partners apart from Hong Kong, means that there is no other source of revenue rather than stimulate internal economy, which means that we are ready to accept the trade-off of short-term risks and short-term deficit unless the other side can provide us a comparative. I think it's kind of too late for Matthew to do that. But last, I just want to engage on the political side, the idea of Trump and Republicans. Note that these policies we are proposing here are relatively bipartisan because these are policies which improve economic welfare, the amount of money that people have within their pocket. This is why Donald Trump was able to win the election by running fucking socialist policies, by telling people we're going to bring you back your factories, we're going to stop outsourcing, we're going to rein in the free market. Things you wouldn't trust a Republican to believe, but they believe it when it actually gets them out of poverty, or they believe that it gets them out of poverty. Even if this is not popular with radical Republicans, it's at least popular with Republicans in swing states whose voters are always fickle and you're not sure whether you can win that state, which means you need to pander to something that is bipartisan and safe in terms of the economic welfare of citizens. I think this gets the Biden government buy-in. Before I explain why I think that buy-in is good, I will take a point from closing government.
So just to be clear, you want Biden under your world who has
I think that's a good idea, because I think Biden and the Democratic Party, in terms of the access to super PACs that they have, are probably still likely to get a huge amount of donations. Not Hillary Clinton before that. Barack Obama as well supported raising corporate taxes. They're still likely to get those donations because the comparative is that the primaries are going to be won by a candidate like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Insofar as you are a Democratic donor or a super PAC, it is less risky to fund a mainstream candidate because the comparative is going to be worse for you. What do I think the bipartisan nature of these policies means? It means, first of all, you get more buy-in for the Biden administration opposition. This means you're going to get less blocking of budgets, less filibustering of important reforms, which is important for the American citizenry in general. And senators want to do this, particularly from moderate states, insofar as their electorates are going to likely want these reforms of fiscal. I think advice in Biden has to implement more strict measures for COVID. But I think secondly, it long-term just disables the rise of populism. Because the reason why Trump won was because of the perception that the elites on either side of the house are just debating things like corporations or debating things like social justice, but not caring about the little guy on the ground. Insofar as Biden can show himself to be different and to actually propose these policies, I think that is going to be disable populists like Trump from rising again. The reason why Republicans buy in, because Republicans already lost to Trump when he proposed these policies and they don't, which means that they have an incentive to support these policies insofar as they also don't want another Trump, because the GOP establishment lost when Trump won. They all are against him. Ted Cruz, Mitt Romney, all of them. So Republicans are going to buy in. You get more stability, more better policy. For all of these reasons, vote for opening opposition.
Would first like to respond to opening opposition claims about the poor being screwed and infrastructure. Then I'll do a lot about politics and explain why Biden's actually screwed over on their side of the house. So firstly, they say that we are already increasing interest rates. And this is particularly important. Just because you're already increasing them doesn't mean that the biggest stimulus package in American history can't increase them more. And to the extent that they are already increased, it is actually worse that you're going to then have to increase them more, because that just screws over the poor even more when people can't access loans as easily. So obviously things can get worse. It isn't a tipping point like everyone always wants to talk about in debates for some reason. But then they say that, this is going to be bad for the poor because corporations have already been okay because of things like capital gains. The first thing to point out is the way that they are going to pay for this policy was incredibly regressive. Now, Tin says, well, you're going to increase corporate taxes. And it is true, Biden has proposed this. He proposed a 3% increase in corporate taxes. The issue is that has already been decreased to a 0.5% increase in corporate taxes. And even that is unlikely to get passed because the corporate Democrats in the Senate are not one to support those sorts of policies because they are funded by corporations. Now, Tin responds to this POI by saying, but they are also funded by people, like they also don't want AOC to win. The issue is the senators in the races that need to vote on those policies do get funding predominantly from Democrats who don't support those sorts of things. Joe Manchin doesn't get support from the same people who give AOC support. Joe Manchin gets support from normal, middle-aged white guys who generally don't like taxes increasing, right? So we'd suggest that it's unlikely that those sorts of policies get increased. Corporations aren't going to want corporate tax rates to increase because it lowers their profits, obviously. They say, well, Bill Gates has supported lowering corporate tax rates. Sure, Bill Gates has. Every other corporation is just going to put all their money into offshore accounts and avoid the taxes anyway, as they do already with the 10% of wealth that's around the world in those sorts of tax havens. All of this suggests that their policies are going to have to increase taxes to some regard. And in order to do so, they're going to have to take money out of the pockets of the poor they're trying to help. The second important thing is that we are already able to help the poor because it takes a lot less money, and it is a comparatively tiny part of the plan to give money to the poor compared to things like infrastructure, because in order to buttress the wealth of someone who already has very, very little wealth, that is a very, very marginal amount of spending. That's why the spending upon things like giving people finances throughout the pandemic was a lot less than the trillions of dollars they're spending on the infrastructure plan, like $2 trillion, right? So this suggests is that we're still able to help the poor in that regard. Now, they say infrastructure is good. We broadly agree that there are some good uses of policies. Naomi's case was just that structurally there will be more bad ones than good ones. So when we explain that the ones structurally that are likely to get proposed are like to be short term, Tin doesn't respond to that. And the reason for that was very, very simple. It was that Biden can't reap the benefits of a long-term infrastructure project. So it is just going to be short-term things like short fixes to bridges that are crumbling when those same bridges are just going to crumble in the next 4 years anyway, because they didn't completely rebuild the bridge, right? These are all short-term projects that can exist that are incredibly politically popular right now, but aren't necessarily good in the long term. But secondly, I want to add a new mechanism here. In order to get the money sent out relatively efficiently, governments often need to contract it out to private organizations. So they have to pay private organizations in lump sums of money, and then they often pick what the spending is on. This is what Obama did in the recovery to the 2008 crisis, because it's incredibly politically unpopular for the government to pick and choose exactly what projects they're spending on, because there's a general mystique around the government being very, very poor regulators, especially in the context of the United States, where typically there haven't seen a lot of things like state-owned corporations. What this means is that those corporations then have editorial control over where the spending goes. So they often just like increase their CEO pay, for example. And even if opposition says you can put like things like requirements of a certain amount of spending in infrastructure within those packages, what ends up happening is corporations just decrease the amount of money they already would have spent on infrastructure and then reappropriate that sort of money to other things. So it just takes away from money that would already been going into the economy. The economy is doing like totally okay, right? Like, surely they say the Delta variant exists. The United States is already vaccinated to a large enough extent in the majority of their population. I think it's like 60% now or something, but they're vaccinated in the people who matter and who are trying to go back to work, to the extent that that's not going to be a huge issue. But secondly, the question is not whether or not the Delta variant hits them, it's whether they close when the Delta variant hits them. The United States is very, very unlikely to do so because Biden has already opened up and he's tied himself to that certain policy, but also just like COVID, like lethargy within the United States is much, much higher than literally any other country. So it'd be incredibly politically unpopular to close after they've already opened and people have already tried to get their jobs back. All of this suggests that on the economy, it's likely that the interest rates are going to have to increase, but their side doesn't actually get that much economic benefit. This is incredibly bad because countries around the world rely upon American interest rates and rely upon the American dollar being strong because they've already taken out loans in American dollars. They've already gotten loads of money in American dollars. Now it is just worse because that money is less valuable, so they're able to do less things. This fucks over the developing world, who are now in much, much increasing debt, which already exists. It just gets much, much worse when the interest rates are incredibly, incredibly higher and the dollars are less important. Finally then, on politics, they say that this is a really, really good issue for Biden to win on because it's bipartisan. No, it's not, right? Like many people in the United States don't support things like increased spending. And the reason for that is very simple. Increased spending is often not perceivable to the average person, i.e. it surely helps the poor to give stimulus checks, but 1.4K in stimulus does not put like a dent into the budget of the average American who has like much more money than that, like who generally has a job, who like has an average income that isn't completely inherent and dependent upon that. Surely it's nice to get that $1,000, but it's not something that's a political tipping point to give support to Biden. But I also just want to point out, increased spending has been stigmatized in the United States in literally every like political realm for the past 20 years, right? When Bush increased spending, the Democrats railed against him. When Obama increased spending, the Republicans railed against him. When Trump increased spending, everyone railed against him too. So it's an incredibly politically unpopular issue. CEO, go for it.
So interest rates are predetermined at the point at which you make the contract. Why does this increase in the interest rate fuck over the developing countries that have already made the contract?
Because the money gets a lot less valuable, right? The American dollars that they have get a lot less valuable. Next. It's just also the case that many people don't really understand the economics of things, but they do understand very, very proximate things like that, i.e. people don't understand how the implication of infrastructure is going to mean, like lead to a money multiplier effect or whatever. I'm just saying econ words, but the point is people don't understand what those words mean. However, people do understand proximate things like that they've been indoctrinated to believe are really, really bad and are crippling to people. That is why people, even though they don't understand what federal debt even means, care very, very deeply about federal deficits. What this means is that this policy ends up trading off with a lot of other political priorities for Biden, because it means that there are large amounts of people within the Senate, as well as supporters of senators, who don't necessarily support this kind of infrastructure. So they're going to be less likely to vote for Biden on other sorts of issues because it's like political horse trading. So they can only agree with Biden on a certain amount of things now because it seems politically unpopular to do so. This makes things like voter reform, which is on the margins very, very good, but is unpopular amongst some key ridings, less likely because you don't have to give up for anything anymore because that political horse trading is less likely. We're very proud of us.
I will start soon then. OG don't have a comparative in this debate. The recovery which they mentioned is definitely not equally distributed. Look at real income rates through quantiles. Rich folks didn't lose any income during COVID. Poor folks lost a lot of income. But secondly, it's not certain, given new variants. Recognize that the large parts of the world is thinking about closing again. We're not sure if the vaccination effort is going to work because of large decreases, for example, in Israel, where a large percent of the population has been vaccinated with 2 doses, but it's now 60% certain you won't get COVID even with 2 Pfizers. But also, this is not only about COVID recovery, but this is about restructuring of the American economy for the future and righting some of the past inequality, wrongs, and the structural deficits of the American economy, the imbalances which accumulated over time. So first, on the characterization of this policy, I mean, recognize that the spending is largely financed by increased the taxes of the richer parts of the population, such as highest income tax rates, corporate gains tax, corporate tax. The feasibility in places where this is not internal US political stuff is already ensured by recent G7 talks that will harmonize the global corporate tax. In all other cases, we do kind of have fiat to pass the policy as a whole, presumably unless Gov proves that spending passes, but other parts of the plan don't pass as a whole. CEG needs to get their facts right here. A huge part of the campaign was increases taxing on the rich, on corporations. This is what Biden actually had to defend against Trump, because Trump was like, you're increasing the taxes on middle classes, and he was like, no, I'm increasing the taxes on the rich. So this is not factually correct what they say, that he's not going to increase any sort of taxes on the corporation. Please note that also this has spending guidelines, the provision, into buying US American products, clear incentives to get the money to the end consumer. This generally happens with construction when you increase the amount of jobs for folks, or when you decrease their tax burden or finance their education. So the claim from OJ that this is just going to go to corporations is factually incorrect when you have big spending plans. But also on the political engagement, though, Republicans want funding for their states, especially in swing states. Sausaging of laws is going to happen always. This was the case with Trump recovery plan as well, so it's not comparative. I don't think like if 2% of the law gets sausage and you put in random provisions in there, I don't care about this comparative. Comparative is that the Democrat corporate senators have an incentive to lower the burden on corporations. That's true. However, they will not kill the policy that literally includes core Democrat values and promises such as college debt, healthcare, minimum wage, and increases the inequality fight, etc., as well as the green transition. This means that they have an incentive to decrease some of the tax burdens on corporations, but they're not going to kill the policy in of itself. Especially, also comparatively, the Republicans are not going to kill the policy in swing states and in all of these places. I'm also not sure why you're going to need this, especially if they don't run the filibuster mechanism. You have a majority in the Senate, so you only need Democrats. I think that's pretty cool. Okay, so what about the idea of a balanced budget? The last balanced budget was Bill Clinton. Trump increased spending, no one cared, it's not popular, it used to be popular maybe, but no one cares anymore. Obama didn't care, Democrats don't care, no one talks about this. Maybe if you're an economist, you realize this is potentially bad. But insofar as we prove, a large part of this is also like through increased taxes on the rich, I don't think that they have a case which wins over our positive impacts there. Okay, let's respond to the inflation. We do expect the Fed to control the inflation. Problem is that they didn't read a lot of Friedman. Money supply does not increase inflation per se if the circulation of the said money is lower. This is the case given post-COVID and current COVID measures, where people don't spend a lot of money, where they don't go out, where they didn't used to spend a lot. Meaning that you can increase the money supply without increasing the inflation, because the rate at which the money circulates in the economy is lower because of COVID and is going to be lower because of COVID for a foreseeable future. But recognize that this argument is contingent on the idea of increasing the money supply, which they don't prove, right? Because the total increase of money supply does not equal the spending of this policy, given that a large part of this is offset by taxing folks further. So this is a redistribution policy and not an increase of money supply policy, such as when the Fed just pumps money into the system, etc., etc. But what is the comparative here? This is where we definitely win, because they don't compare to our benefits. Look, increase of interest rates to some extent will, on one hand, prop up the savings of US citizens, which is a good thing. It might harm them for potential investments or indebtedness. This is a bad thing. However, please note that on a comparative for a middle-income family, getting rid of your college debt, which is a part of the plan, or your healthcare coverage going up, are much bigger set-offs than your mortgage rate going up a couple of percents, even in the worst-case scenario for opening government. Meaning that the incentives, for example, of increasing the minimum wage to 15%, which is a part of the plan, compare that to the potential slagging of real wage rates due to inflation and nominal wages being sticky and stagnating, which is the best-case scenario or the worst-case scenario from opening government. The comparative is, even if inflation happens, the provisions of the plan help the poorest and the middle-income families most. The inflation might screw the people on the top most, but we don't care about this, particularly in this policy, unless EG runs a really good trickle-down economics case. The developing world, interest parity will be fulfilled still, meaning that exchange rates change as the interest rates in the US dollar change. Noting that because the US dollar is floated internationally, it's not controlled by the market, the debt will be easier to pay off for any countries that denominate in dollar, because dollar is going to be worth less because the inflation on dollar is more. This is very easy. I don't think that they prove that there are differential influences or that the inflation is going to go more up than the exchange rate is going to go more down. Specifically, given that you can loan in other currencies, that happens, euro, yen, like renminbi, even though nowadays. So I think that there are pressures for these countries to just like swap their loans in other currencies if this happens. I want to take CG and then run the last thing.
So Biden is getting eaten alive politically right now because this plan requires a lot of bipartisan support, meaning given Republicans concessions that Democrats hate. Why the fuck should he stay with it?
Because the majority of the plan is still going to be passed. So your argument is there's a big Democrat support. He's a Democratic president, and he's going to do more for the Republicans than for Democratic goals. I think this is really implausible. Every time you have a big policy, you need to give concessions to the other side, but I already preempted this in a couple of ways why these concessions are not going to be too much to undermine the core values of the plan. Structural impact on the economy. This will incentivize the economies of the future, green and digital transition. This is the key to ensure long-term growth and productivity of the American economy. It also has impacts on the commitments of other countries and their spendings, and it increases the perception of commitment, which is important for global warming, given Trump's pullout, which means that other countries are also incentivized to invest in the green transition, as is done in the European Union, as is done in China. But this is very important given the US international standings. But also lastly, recognize that comparatively, other major powers such as EU and China are already investing in these things a huge amount. That means that the future looks very bleak if the United States doesn't also foot their bill as well here. Long-termly, this means the slagging of US growth, the real standard of living dropping, and US losing the competitive edge. This not only has real-term consequences that you're not going to be employed as a US citizen, particularly those who are far worse off, but also has political ones, which Tin explains they don't engage. Very proud to oppose.
Great. I thank the speaker.
need to support the most and win this debate. Two extensions. Firstly, why this is uniquely effective in supporting the most vulnerable people who've lost their jobs. Secondly, why this is the best and only time to renew infrastructure that is particularly important. But before that, I want to kick out CG from this debate. I have three responses to their case. Firstly, their benefit at their best is incredibly speculative, because at the very least, you have 2 years of safety and certainty and 4 years of Biden in presidency. But at the same time, in 4 years' time, people would forget about all the money that, debt that Joe Biden has incurred. I don't understand what the impact of this is in 4 years' time. Secondly, they don't give a comparative, because who can compete against Joe Biden, especially the Republicans that have lost trust in COVID-19 and handling crisis, for example. I don't understand why they are a viable candidate under their sort of house anyway. Third of all, this is obviously contingent on good outcome, or bad outcome rather. So if our extension proves that this is actually good for the people on the ground, we flip their case. Let's engage with OG, because OG's only impact is inflation. I have three responses to this. Firstly, this is not an instant flow of money, because obviously you will not give everything you got to corporations at an instant. You obviously graduate this payment for the reason that you want corporations to make sure that they finish their projects, but also wages. You don't give a year worth of wages at one particular month. It's a gradual process. That's why it doesn't really happen at an instant. It's not going to be a huge inflation. Given that this would happen anyway, as per OG's analysis, and also CG supporting things like welfare, for example, vouchers, for example. I don't understand what the marginal increase in this is. Second of all, OG is inconsistent, because if their claim is, well, you're going to raise taxation, then presumably there's not going to be an net increase in the money that exists in the economy. So it's unclear why inflation happens at the same time taxation happens. But lastly, I would argue that I don't think they do a much job as to why inflation is bad. I would argue inflation is oftentimes a good thing, for the reason that it incentivizes people to put in their money to banks and put in their bank money to investment, for example, as opposed to keeping it in their house, which means you obviously increase corporations' ability to employ people, which is obviously immediate benefit that we can access on the outside of the house, which is more important than whatever the economic benefit that they can incur in future, because obviously future is uncertain and you need to support the most vulnerable people that are fucking dying right now. First extension, why is this uniquely effective? I think infrastructure building is uniquely good because it delivers on the people who are already fucked over by this COVID crisis for two reasons. Firstly, is the question of where do you build infrastructure? And the answer to this is obviously not rich communities, because they obviously don't fucking need infrastructure. It costs time and money to take down the existing infrastructure. So it obviously makes no economic sense. You obviously start building it where it doesn't exist, because there's nothing to replace in the first instance, for example. So this necessarily, and corporations obviously have an incentive to enter the most vulnerable communities, for example, where people have literally lost jobs, because that's where infrastructure does not exist right now. And that's where the marginal cost of increasing infrastructure is the lowest. Second of all, who do you hire? Because I think human resources are necessary on the outside of the house at a grand scale, because you obviously need to transport a lot of goods. You obviously need truck drivers, for example, that transport a lot of raw materials from one place to another. Importantly, I think these are people who don't necessarily have sophisticated skills, for example, which were the first one to get cut in the COVID-19 crisis, where corporations did not have much capacity to continue hiring people. These are the people that are going to be hired on the outside of the house. These are the employment that we create on the outside of the house that is particularly important. Why is the comparative not able to deliver on these people? That is for two reasons, and I'm going to take OG and CG at their best. First of all, consumption patterns are unequal. This means, obviously, at the point at which people are able to go out, they might go to a shop, they might go to a supermarket, but they're definitely not going to go to a construction, for example. They're definitely not going to buy housing, for example, because they see future as uncertain, because that is a luxury, which is why these people are not going to be helped under their side of the house anyway. Second of all, we cannot finance corporations instantly or directly under their side of the house, because obviously people still think COVID-19 crisis is uncertain. They have an incentive to keep their money to bank account, for example. I don't understand what the scale of this consumption is. I think this is the most important, direct, and immediate way to deliver on the people who have lost their jobs. And this is by far the most important impact in this debate, because literally these people have no alternative. They're literally dying on the ground, right? I think this is the important actor that we ought to protect in this debate. Noticeably, things like subsidy is obviously not enough, because these things are intermittent as well as uncertain. So these people cannot cling on these people to live everyday life. Literally, giving them jobs is the only way out. Second of all, why is this the best and only time to renew infrastructure? All says infrastructure is good, and I think this is true. And I'm going to extend this harm, because I think literally in the United States of America right now, pipelines are getting old, which means poor communities especially don't have drinkable water, for example. So it comes at the interest of literally many people in America in the status quo. But the question that OO does not ask in this debate is, why is this package uniquely necessary, given that CG also characterizes the need for things like climate change? First of all, if you do not do it now, you'll never do this again under their side of house. And this is for three reasons. Firstly, because in the context of COVID-19, you have normalized the concept of debt, because obviously governments have already issued a lot of bonds, for example. So numerically, people don't understand difference between 1 billion and perhaps 20 billion. It's literally the optical value of debt and optical negative value of debt has decreased in the COVID-19 context, which enables governments to afford these things in the first instance. Second of all, there's a unique push for creation of job in the status quo, which means big spending is also justified in this context. But lastly, on the their side of the house, politicians don't, like in usual times, don't have an incentive to afford these things for the reason that infrastructure is oftentimes a long-term project. So it takes a lot of time for the benefits to manifest, which means politicians who are bound by short-term electoral cycles oftentimes don't have an incentive to actively do these things, but rather increase things that are more immediate, things like welfare, which means under their side of the house, all of these problems with regards to pipelines, for example, and roads getting old will not be solved under their side of the house, even into the future. That is why this is a unique way to deliver on the benefit of people on the ground that are suffering right now. The second thing I want to note is that on the comparative, even if they have these things like infrastructure renewal under their side of the house, it does not get to the most vulnerable people who need it the most. But before I move on, I want to take closing government.
Yeah, so the reason why you are losing currently is because you don't explain why the plan is going to succeed. Given Republican obstructionism, given that these companies are unpredictable, can you give us some reasons why this plan is not going to fall flat on Biden's face?
Yeah, so optically right now, the people perceive this as maybe not certain, but we prove that it is likely to succeed in 2 years' time, 4 years' time, which is when election happens. So that short-term problem is not a problem in this debate. Secondly, why is the comparative worse? I think in a comparative, you don't get infrastructure for the most poorest of the communities for two reasons. Firstly, they have least political power. That is to say, they don't have enough political power to petition politicians, for example, or lobby politicians to incentivize these people to come into this region. But secondly, they have the least financial power to afford things like infrastructure. I think this problem is solved in the outside of house for two reasons. Firstly, because of oversupply of income, which means they can neglect profitability uniquely in this situation because the government is pumping in a lot of money to corporations, which means they're not necessarily bound by things like economic interest, but also they have an incentive to look for new customers, for example. So there's an incentive to expand into vulnerable communities as well. But secondly, uniquely in this instance, you can benefit from the economies of scale. This necessarily means, for example, to the extent you're massively affording a big project, the marginal cost of production for vulnerable community even reduces, which means it reduces the cost for the communities that are able to afford these goods on the outside of the house, which means these communities uniquely have access to these things that are particularly important for their lives on the outside of the house. We are the team that saves the most important and most vulnerable stakeholders in this debate. I don't think other teams explained why their impact was significant or important in the first instance. We clearly take this debate from closing opposition.
starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, why we take over OO, nextly engaging with CG, and lastly, engaging with OG. So why do we take over opening opposition? This is for 2 reasons. Firstly, if you listen very, very closely to opening opposition, a lot of their mechanisms rely on things like intuition pumps, right? Because they don't actually prove why the economy gets better. They just say things like cheap shipping, you get to commute to work to your job, or you get digital infrastructure, but they actually never prove why these things lead to an expansion of the economy. And therefore, a lot of their benefits are actually not quite mechanized. It is not sure why any of them actually accrue or what kind of economic benefits they were aiming for in the first place, right? Compared to the benefit that came from Tota, when we told you that firstly, we obviously create things like jobs, but secondly, at the point where you create infrastructure, you also provide things like clean water to people. You provide things like electricity for people on the ground, right? Which is firstly not contingent upon the economy expanding. It brings immediate benefits to people on the ground, which is a proven benefit, which putting opposition does not have. But secondly, I think it is actually more mechanized in improving why we get economy expansion in the long run, at the point where you have more people working who have purchasing power, you have water and electricity, which means that companies are more willing to go in and create things like jobs within these areas, right? But secondly, I think that we're the only team that proves why it's the Gov bench cannot claim that they get some of our benefits, right? Because of the reason that Tota told you that this is something that can only be done right now, and we're only able to achieve the scale of these benefits and the welfare that we do right now, right? Because if you do it at any other time, it's going to be too massive. You're going to get massive political opposition, right? What this does is, firstly, it engages to a lot of Gov's analysis that, if we get a Biden administration, everything is going to be good, because it proves that it's not that necessarily true. Like, you can't save these people, these most vulnerable people that are uniquely saved by this infrastructure plan in the government paradigm. But secondly, it proves that a lot of the benefits that they claim, that they can also do things like, provide things like rent exemption or things like scholarships, are at best short term, right? They're likely to be redacted in the long term, whereas our benefits are stretched far more into the future, right? I think it's just a better engagement to what comes from government side, which is why we take over OO. So firstly, firstly, let's engage with CG, right? And firstly, let's engage to their only engagement to us was that this doesn't happen quickly, right? I think that this is assertive. It's just examples. They don't give us any structural analysis for this. But secondly, like, at best it hurts OO because their benefits are long-term. Like, it doesn't hurt us because even if it takes 8 years to finish a project, it takes like a moment to start it, right? Because the project is already set, which means you get immediate jobs. You get things like immediately people being able to feed their families, etc., right? So it was unclear why it was like not an immediate benefit, which means that we're more likely to have things like public support in our side of the house, which flips a lot of the benefits coming from CG, right? Well, let's engage a bit more with the arguments, right? Firstly, they said that Biden will lose power in our side of the house. Firstly, notice that CG at best proves why the Republicans are corrupt. He does not they do not prove why Biden is necessarily better, right? They just say, in like their own analysis, that Biden compromises a lot and is controlled by corporations and the rich. So I don't understand why Biden is necessarily a good actor, which means a lot of their benefits are quite like very, very vague, right? But even if this was true, right? Firstly, their first mechanism is that entrenches the narrative that he provides only cares about the rich and the corporations. Like, firstly, as they say to OG, I'm not sure what the marginal difference is if the narrative is already there, right? You slightly strengthen the narrative that Republicans are already pushing for, that is also on social media. I don't understand to what degree that changes voters' minds, or to what degree this narrative increases. But secondly, even if this is true that this narrative exists, I think that Biden has a lot of incentive to be quite transparent in the way that he does this, right? Because elections are coming up, etc., which means that Biden has to the degree that Biden wants to stay in power or pass policies, etc., it means he has an incentive to, make sure like that people are actually getting benefits on the ground, that these corporations are not like corrupt one that he has connections to. He's likely to give explanations as to why he specifically chose this corporation, right? So it's unlikely that this is the case. But thirdly, even taking them at their best case and saying that this narrative does increase in our side of the house, it's a question, right? What do people care about most? Getting things like jobs, or getting things, slightly believing that Biden is more corrupt? We argue that people are more likely to support Biden because he gives them jobs, even if they think he's a bit more corrupt, because obviously jobs are the basic like fundamentals for their sustenance. They can literally not live without their jobs. It's the most visible and important benefit to these people, even if they believe that politicians are more corrupt. So even taking them at their best, we think our benefits actually help Biden, right? Secondly, they say that, it will interest the narrative that Biden is socialist. Firstly, I don't understand why this changes at the point where they're claiming that they still do things like cancel student debt, right? But secondly, again, I don't understand why this changes. Still, right-wing and Republicans have an incentive to peddle this narrative. So I'm not sure what the marginal difference is. But even taking CG at their best, right? I think that are at best uncertain, because things can happen before election cycles. Things like scandals, things like, corruption scandals, things like people doing things, unpopular policies passing, or sudden uprising of the pandemic. It's at best uncertain, whereas our benefits are far, far more clear for the most vulnerable people in society. So I think we're able to outweigh them on that metric, right? I'll take a PR from OG.
Our case was not just inflation. We said that we're going to get more money in the long term because of a savings opportunity cost, which helps the poor more by a larger cushion during economic crisis and a longer term capitalization of the welfare state. This is more certain than Biden's popularity, which we already proved would decrease when he's compromising having tax increase and bureaucracies watering down benefits.
Okay, firstly, that's very, very long, therefore should not be credited. But secondly, like I actually don't understand, because at best that's like a long-term benefit that happens through a lot of mechanisms, right? Whereas in our side of the house, we're just able to give people jobs directly. I think that's just like far more low in terms of risk, and far more immediate and far more like directly beneficial, right? It's at best, like considering that people are starving right now, I think it's more important that we get them jobs right now, right? So let's engage with opening government first. So the first thing that they say is, the economy is currently okay because of domestic vaccinations and also because of international vaccinations. Right? Okay, so even if we take, firstly, I agree that domestic vaccinations are not necessarily working for the reason that a lot of Republicans are refusing to take the vaccine because of things like spreading of conspiracy theories, because they do not trust the Biden administration, etc. But even putting that aside, I argue that's hardly solved on the international sphere, because firstly, there are new strains of things like the Delta virus, but secondly, because the vaccinations are often centered on the most rich countries, which means the majority of countries in the world, especially the developing ones, are not able to actually open up their economies. This is especially damaging because firstly, these are the biggest and most rapidly expanding markets, but secondly, the majority of US manufacturing and creation of production developing countries are not opening up. US cannot produce goods to export anyways, or if they do, it's massively expensive because they're producing it within America. And to the degree that people are poor because of COVID, they're unlikely to buy those products, which means that the economy is unlikely to be a code. But even the worst case scenario, right? It's at best a long-term benefit because developing nations are slowly going to get vaccines and they're slowly going to have to do things like rehire staff, etc. Right? We argue that our benefits just much more beneficial for directly and immediately beneficial for people on the ground. Lastly, they say that this causes things like inflation, right? Firstly, like they themselves says that, and I think that every team has pointed out that the FDI can just increase interest rates. So it's unclear why this inflation is going to happen. And also to the degree that Biden, as gov banks themselves say, have an election coming up, like if an inflation is happening, it's going to fuck over the economy. I think he has an incentive to deal with it anyways, right? But secondly, like at the moment, they don't have a clear counterfactual. I would argue that even if we risk some like raising of inflation or whatever, the fact that we're able to at least give jobs to the more poor people in society is just a far, far more concrete and more important and direct benefit we are happy to oppose.
Great. I thank that speaker, and in fact, thank all speakers for a very fine debate. Please leave the Zoom so we may